Hello and welcome to the Feeling Good podcast. I am your host, Fabrice Nye, and joining me here in the Murrieta studios is Dr. David Burns. Hi, David.
Hi, Fabrice.
Dr. David Burns has been a pioneer in the development of cognitive therapy, and he is the creator of the new TEAM therapy. He is the author of Feeling Good, which has sold over 5 million copies in the United States and has been translated into over 20 languages. He is an emeritus adjunct clinical professor of psychiatry at the Stanford University School of Medicine. Welcome to episode 112 of the Feeling Good podcast. Today we're going to talk about truth techniques. And the truth techniques in your panoply of, the 50 ways, and I refer people back to that episode we did on the 50 ways in 50 minutes, which actually turned out to be into 2 episodes. But so those were episodes 93 and 94. And so the truth techniques are examine the evidence, the experimental method,
technique, yep,
and the survey technique,
and also reattribution. And before we go into it, I have 2 quick promos. Number 1, I have to promote my co-host, Fabrice. I was telling Fabrice before we started recording that everywhere I go, I get heaps of praise for Fabrice, for the way we work together. You have a little skepticism. It creates a kind of an interesting dance for people. Yeah. But heap of praise for you, Fabrice. And just if your ears are burning, I get it all the time now.
Well, thank you for saying that. I think that your promo seems to be working. I've been getting calls from people from overseas who want to do video sessions with me. That's been kind of interesting.
Oh, that's neat. Yeah. Do you have any spaces in your practice? Can you use referrals if people would love to work with Fabrice?
Yeah, typically I do, yes.
And would they go to your website, and what's your web address?
They can just email me, Fabrice at life.net. We can put that in the show notes.
Life.net. The other thing is we put out a pitch about a month ago telling you listeners that we want you to help promote us because we're not experts in marketing. And at that point, we were up to 50,000 downloads a month, which is mind-blowing to Fabrice and me. And it looks like we're right now up near or at 60,000 podcasts per month.
Yeah. What I would recommend to our listeners is, number 1, a good way to promote us would be to leave a 5-star rating on iTunes. If you feel like our podcast is worth 5 stars, that's one good way. A second good way is to let your friends know about it. So, I heard this great podcast, and point them to the Feeling Good podcast, or just forward some of the show notes that you may have found interesting.
And that's one other thing. A lot of people have written and said, "What are show notes? Where do I get the show notes? What's a show note?" Well, a show note is just the things that I slave over, little brief write-ups summarizing what we do in the podcast and often providing additional information. And if you want the show notes, they're on my website, www.feelinggood.com, and you go to there's a tab in the upper left-hand corner for the Feeling Good podcast, and then you can go in there and find the show notes, and also there's a widget in the upper right-hand corner that you can just sign up with your email, and then every time we have a podcast, you'll get a notification.
You get a notification, exactly, yeah.
And then you'll also have access to the show notes. And one other thing, tell them about your indexing project.
Oh, before I talk about this, one more thing on the show notes. Depending on what their podcast application is, they can actually, there's a way to click on certain buttons. I mean, there's such a variety of podcast apps, so I don't want to give details, but there should be a way to see at least a summary of the show note for each episode if they click in the proper place. So.
Yeah, I think if you get them on Facebook too, you can click and see the whole. They give a piece of of the show notes.
So there's a variety of ways to do that.
Yeah.
So about the indexing. Yes.
This was a brilliant one of your many brilliant ideas, I might say.
So I've had half a dozen people who volunteered to help, and I've been kind of remiss in getting back to those people because of been preparing for a presentation, but we have now a list of all the episodes with the episode number, the title, a link to the audio file, and a link to the show notes that people can find. And we're still working on getting the keywords tagged for each of the episodes, and a short summary that will, fit within 2 or 3 sentences, so people know what each episode is about without having to go to the entire show note.
Yeah, so this will turn the Feeling Good podcast series into a rich, researchable resource for you.
Right.
So if you want to find the podcasts on the 5 secrets of effective communication, we probably had 8 or at least.
Right.
And you can find exactly what those are and click to them and so forth.
Yeah, we want this to be a resource so people can find what they're looking for. Now we have over 100 episodes. It's becoming a little bit cumbersome to find what you want.
Yeah.
So yes, and thank you so much to all those volunteers who are willing to do this. So stay tuned for this. In a few weeks, I hope to have a page that give the indexing.
Okay, well now we're going to do truth-based techniques, and this goes back to the earliest days of cognitive therapy when I was first working with Beck, and there were maybe 5 or 10 cognitive therapists in the world, and he just had a very few techniques. He had the idea that distorted negative thoughts cause depression and anxiety and anger. But there weren't a huge number of techniques for challenging and crushing the negative thoughts. But one of the categories are truth-based techniques, and the brief history of that is that Beck thought of depressed individuals as being kind of like scientists who had a wrong theory.
Huh.
And he talked about depression as being due to a negative view of the self, the world, and the future, and that all these thoughts about yourself, I'm a loser, I'm no good, I'll be depressed forever, that they're distorted. They're not valid thoughts. They're due to all or nothing thinking, overgeneralization, all there's the 10 distortions in my book, Feeling Good. And then, so he said, just like a scientist tests a theory, we could train depressed individuals to test what they're telling themselves. And one category is called examine the evidence, and that's kind of like a scientist who doesn't have to do an experiment, but can go to the library or search the internet and get information, get data relative to
some like a literature research.
Yeah, a literature research. That's right. And but some things cannot be answered through literature research, and so there you need to actually do an experiment in the laboratory. And so a second category is the experimental technique, having patients create and do experiments to test the validity of what they're telling themselves.
So essentially the difference between examine the evidence and the experimental technique is that examine the evidence is for something we already know, while the experimental technique is something we need to find out.
That's right. Mm-hmm. That's perfect. Absolutely. And that's why people love the banter between the two of us, because just a little thing like that can make it so nice and crystal clear. Right. Mm-hmm. And then the survey technique is a certain kind of experiment. Sometimes scientists will experiment with chemicals in the laboratory, but sometimes you can go out and do a survey of 1 or more people to find out how they feel, what they think about a certain topic, how they feel about you. So those are the 3 we'll be discussing on the show. And then the 4th is called Reattribution, also one of Beck's very first techniques. We've discussed that previously, so we won't go into that so much now, but the definition of that is self-blame is a very common problem in depression, particularly, and anxiety too.
Yeah.
And you're blaming yourself. You're beating up on yourself, holding yourself entirely to blame, maybe for something you weren't completely responsible for. So when you do the reattribution, you look at all the variables that could have gone into a certain event or a certain outcome, other than the fact that you're a loser or you're bad or it's all your fault.
Yeah, we tend to take credit for way too much.
Oh, yeah. Like I had a patient, just to give an example of this, and he had obsessive compulsive disorder.
Oh, yeah, right, yes.
And he had this idea that, he was going to hurt people. Yeah. Not through violence, but
just
accidentally.
Through thinking.
Yes, that's right. And he had this idea that a woman had asked him for directions on how to get someplace.
Yeah.
A woman he worked with. And so he told her the route that he usually took, which he thought was a reasonably fast route. And then for months, and then he told me about it, months after this happened, but he'd been plagued for months with the thought, if she follows that route, that will change the whole trajectory of her life. And so if something horrible happens to her, like she's killed in an auto accident, it'll be my fault. And he's obsessing about this all day long. So that would be a good one for reattribution.
Yeah.
But he's thinking he's the cause of all these bad things. And then you'd also have to think of hidden emotion model. We're wavering from the topic, but this is kind of a fun little digression, then we'll get into the other three truth-based techniques. Can you think of any hidden emotion that might be lurking underneath this fellow's obsession?
Under his OCD?
Yeah.
Well, one of the common hidden emotion is anger.
Yeah, and who might he be angry with?
There's only one person he could be angry with. It's that woman.
Yeah, and that's simple because we're familiar with the model, but 99 out of 100 therapists will not think of this. They'll be thinking of exposure and cognitive therapy techniques. Yeah. But there's a good chance he's kind of angry with her, and instead of expressing those feelings in a constructive or loving or respectful way, he sweeps them under the carpet, and they come out as, he's something he did is going to kill her.
Yeah, right.
And that's a kind of psychoanalytic concept, but a very practical and real one. Well, let's get into truth-based techniques.
Yeah. Let's see how they work.
Now, examine, and I might say that none of these techniques will be effective without team therapy, and what that means is without setting an agenda with the patient. And seeing if the patient really wants help, really wants to recover, and melting away the patient's resistance first. Because if you go in and try to attack somebody's distorted thought without empathizing or melting away their resistance, you'll likely run into yes-butting and resistance. So we'll just assume, for the purpose of today's recording, that we've melted away the resistance.
This is something that is always true when we describe a particular technique or method. We assume that the work of building the empathic bond and melting away the resistance has been done. So the client, when we get to the technique, is already motivated.
Yes, absolutely. Now, in examine the evidence, I could give you many examples of it, and listeners, you can probably think of examples in your own life, and I can think of example in my own life. But in my new book, I'm having a chapter on a woman. I think I've changed her name to protect her identity, so I won't use a name, but she was the woman who did the live demo with Jill and me at the intensive about 4 years ago. Mm-hmm. And she was the one whose daughter had been shot in the face. The daughter said, "Can I go out and play after dinner?" And this had happened for years. And then she said, "Okay." She was a little reluctant. And then her daughter went out to play, and the boy snuck up on the daughter and shot her in the mouth with a high-powered pellet rifle, causing a lot of damage to her mouth and teeth, and led to 9 years of treatments for the daughter for post-traumatic stress disorder and multiple surgeries on her mouth. And then the woman who Jill and I were treating had the thought, I'm a bad mom because I let my daughter go out and play. And it's a good one for let's define terms as well as examine the evidence, because she had spent the entire 9 years, loving her daughter and taking her daughter to every possible form of therapy to get help, which fortunately the daughter now has finally recovered, and after the workshop, the patient we treated recovered, and then her daughter recovered. Her daughter just recently was married, and things are great now. But the woman had been suffering for 9 years, but overlooking the fact that she did all of these loving things for her daughter. But the problem is when you say I'm a bad mom, you feel guilty, and then you get involved in emotional reasoning. I feel bad, so I must be bad. That's just a simple example of how you'd examine the evidence. What's the evidence I'm a bad mom? Well, my daughter got shot. What's the evidence I'm not a bad mom? Well, I've done that. I'm a good mom. I've done all these tremendous things.
Been accumulated,
yeah, and then in addition, in order to have known that my daughter was going to get shot in the face, I'd have to have been able to predict the future. Is that what a good mom does?
Yeah.
So it was a tremendous therapy session, and she went into a state of euphoria, really, ended 9 years of suffering. Now, let's define terms wasn't the only technique that we used.
Examine the evidence?
Yeah, I'm sorry, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, let's define term, which we probably also used, is a semantic technique.
Now, do we need to talk about any more about that?
Well, I know that you get to that once you've done...
we can give you even a better example. I'm interrupting you. Shut up.
So what I wanted to say was you get to that after you've done your agenda setting, but once you get into examining the evidence, the patients still have a lot of thoughts. I say, but no, it can't be. So how do you get them to actually find the evidence? Because if you put those words in their mouth, they say, yeah, but no, that's not really good evidence. They're going to downplay what you're putting in their mouth. So how do you get them to find this evidence?
Great question. That's why you have to use a lot of different techniques. We knew this woman was very, very compassionate.
Yeah.
And so we used the paradoxical double standard technique.
Well, yes.
Would you say this to a dear friend of yours?
Yeah, exactly.
What would you say to her?
Yeah.
And why? That's a good one. We also used externalization of voices.
And that, of course, all those techniques kind of overlap.
Yeah.
But when you do the paradoxical double standard, which I refer people back to some episodes where we demonstrated it, when you're playing the role of the good friend, you're actually coming up with some evidence for your friend.
Yes, that's right.
So you actually are doing it.
Yes, that's right. And the therapist can play the role of the friend who had the daughter who was shot and say, doesn't this mean I'm a bad mother?
Yeah.
And I feel guilty. Doesn't that mean I'm a bad mother?
Yeah.
And one thing that Jill Levitt mentioned in group the other night, the Tuesday training group, that I hadn't heard, is when you put the evidence for your negative thought, you have to think in terms of an attorney in court.
Mm-hmm.
And so just because you feel like a bad mother, that wouldn't stand up in court. What's the evidence that you're a bad mother? Or what's the definition of a bad mother? What's the definition of a good mother? Yeah. So anyway, that's that that technique.
Yeah.
You can also do it as a double column technique. You can draw a line down.
Evidence for and evidence against.
Yeah, left-hand column, evidence for, right-hand column, evidence against.
How do you often do that?
No. The new techniques are so powerful with the agenda setting. Is that, I have a list of 50 techniques in my new book, Feeling Great. I have all those 50 techniques, but I also have a list of 50 additional newer techniques.
Yeah, right.
But the paradoxical agenda setting has become so powerful that I generally don't need to go much beyond examine or just straightforward technique.
Yeah.
While they're identifying the distortions, I ask them to give examples. And all of a sudden, they come up with
that's what I find often with some of my clients.
Yeah,
we just go through a mood journal, and by the time we're done listing all the positive side of the thoughts, they're like, I'm okay now.
Yeah,
good. I don't believe in this anymore.
Yeah, and of course, the original Examine the Evidence in my TED Talk, which you can find a link to if you go to my website, was this woman who my first cognitive therapy patient. I think we've talked about her, the woman, Latvian immigrant who had attempted suicide. You remember that one?
No, I don't remember.
Well, she was one of my first patients, and I asked if I could present her in Beck's Tuesday group, and she said, "Oh, okay," and because I was giving out drugs and listening and asking patients to vent, and very few of my patients were getting better, so I was trying something new, and so I said, what should I do? How could I use this cognitive therapy with a suicidal patient? Because she was referred from the intensive care unit and had almost died. And he said, well, ask her, what was she thinking when she attempted suicide? Are you sure we haven't gone over this one? Well, anyway.
We may have, but
we have.
I'm not
we're both so
haven't.
old we can't remember.
I'm not saying we haven't. It's just
But at any rate, she said, so I went back and she said, well, what did Dr. Beck say? And I said, well, he said, you need to tell me, what were you thinking just before you attempted suicide?
Yeah.
And she said, I was just telling myself I'm a worthless person because I've never accomplished anything of importance in my life, anything meaningful. And then she said, what should I do about it? And I said, well, I'll ask Dr. Beck at the seminar this week, and I'll tell you next week.
Yeah.
So she came back the next week. I asked him, he said, well, Examine the Evidence. Ask her to list 5 things she has accomplished. So I told her that the next week, and she said, well, that's the problem. I can't think of anything. I've never accomplished anything. What should I do? And I said, well, take it as a homework assignment. Because I didn't know what to do either.
Right. Yeah.
And maybe you can think of something between sessions. Then the next week she came in, and I forgot I'd given her this assignment and asked her about the antidepressant, as I would do every week, and asked her to vent and say how she was feeling. And then halfway through she said, well, didn't you want to see my list? And I said, oh, I forgot. Did you come up with anything? And then she handed me this list of 10 things, and the first one was that she'd smuggled her children out of Nazi Germany.
Oh, now I remember.
Do you remember that?
Yes.
Yeah, and got to America and saved the lives of her children. Her husband died in the concentration camps, all the other relatives, and then she worked scrubbing floors to support them, and her son had just graduated from Harvard Business School, first in his class, and she spoke 4 languages, and was a gourmet chef, had all this amazing stuff.
Yeah.
And then I said, well, how do you reconcile that with this conviction that you're a worthless human being because you've never accomplished anything? She said, it doesn't compute. It makes no sense now. I said, how are you feeling? She says, I'm feeling a lot better. Do you have some more techniques? And I said, well, you have to wait another week.
Now I remember that story, yeah.
Now, experimental technique, you have the person actually go out and do an experiment. And we've talked about this on previous podcasts, but for example, panic attacks is the most obvious. When patients have panic attacks, half the time they think I'm on the verge of death, of a heart attack. They think they're about to have a heart failure, or they think they're about to smother, and suffocate, or they may think they're about to go crazy, have a psychotic episode. And so they're generally sitting there not moving for fear they'll have a heart attack, or they're trying to hang on to their sanity, afraid that they'll go crazy. And the technique that is dramatically effective, if the therapist has the courage to do it, is when I induce a panic attack and I ask them try to bring on a heart attack through strenuous exercises. And they're scared to do that.
So here's a good example, actually. How would you induce a panic attack? Because a lot of times when the client is in the therapist room, that is not the environment that tends to induce the panic attacks.
Well, you can go out with them into the world if in a situation where they would ordinarily find anxiety provoking, like someone with agoraphobia, they're afraid of being outdoors. You can actually go outdoors with them. You can have them do these things when they have a natural panic attack at home, just to do it at that moment. For example, if they think they're going to go crazy, they get dizzy, they'll hyperventilate and get dizzy and say, I'm going crazy, you can have them try to go crazy. And if you can get them induce a panic attack in the office, you can have them try to go crazy right in the office. It's great if you can do it when you're with them, because you can push them.
Exactly.
Otherwise, they'll resist.
They'll be resistant.
Yeah. And then they try to go crazy. They have them scream, roll around on the floor, talk in tongues, babble incoherently, try to become psychotic, and they quickly discover it's impossible. And then that's generally the ends of years or even decades of panic attacks. But that's just one example of an experiment, and there's a lot of ways you can be having patients do experiments. We won't go into all of them right now. But the survey, any questions on?
Well, actually, go on to the survey technique, but we might be able to tie into the experimental technique too.
Yeah. Well, survey is just a particular kind of truth-based technique, a particular kind of experiment. Now, again, I don't think I went over this, but I was on a hike a couple weeks ago. Did I mention this with a therapist who had severe social anxiety?
You may have mentioned it, but I didn't really hear the full story.
Well, if we went over that one, she thought her face was going to freeze up. She'd get anxious, and people would see how anxious she was, and she's kind of a fraud.
Well, that's kind of true for anybody who has some kind of social anxiety. People are going to see it.
Yeah. Well, did I give that story?
Well, tell me again.
Well, because I have another one from Pasadena, but we can do that one. It was someone, a really lovely woman, and she's got a booming practice now, and she's very beloved, but she has this issue. Every now and then her social anxiety will flare up, and then she gets incredibly self-conscious and very self-critical.
Yeah.
And one thing, she thinks her face starts twitching.
Yeah.
And it would happen to her in the Tuesday group, and she'd just be horrified with shame and humiliation. What if someone sees that this is going on? Yeah. And so I hadn't seen her for a while, and she came on a hike because she said she had a little relapse of her social anxiety. And it was a particularly big hike. We had about 15 hikers, and we were in the park, Foothill Park, that and we were on one of the trails. And she mentioned that to me, so I said, well, we've got to do a little survey here.
Yeah.
And I said, everybody stop, because so-and-so has an announcement to make, and she's just terrified. And she didn't know a lot of the people. And I also stopped some hikers and said, we need you to join our group here for a minute. And then I kind of really pushed her and made her confess that she had this severe social anxiety had returned, and she thought even now her face was twitching, and it was so horrible. So I said, let's all twitch our faces together. So we all started twitching our face like this. And then she burst out laughing. And then, she said, well, I treat people, I treat social anxiety, and I myself have right now severe social anxiety. Do you think less of me? Do you think I'm less competent? And they said, no, we think more of you. It makes you human. We've got flaws too. And I said, ask these strangers here. And she said, well, would you ever want to refer someone to me, a therapist who has social anxiety? Yes, I have a lot of skills, but I'm flawed in this way, and it doesn't seem shameful. And then they said, can we get your website, and do you have any cards, because we have some people we want to refer to you.
Super.
It really happened. It was just, she couldn't believe it.
Yeah.
And I saw her the next week. She said, I said, you're still having a problem? She said, oh no, I'm in enlightenment again.
Now I want to make a point is that
Yes.
the first thing you did, which is, everyone twitching, this is a humor-based technique. This is the
Right.
paradoxical magnification.
Good point.
Yeah.
Good point. I love that.
So
yeah.
it was actually probably a good setup to then do the survey technique among the group.
Yes, and also you have to have trust with your patient to do these extreme things.
Yeah, well, yes.
She really trusted me and knew that I wasn't trying to make fun of her or something like that.
Yeah.
And I should also say that these techniques are very powerful and can be abused because I knew that she would get a good feedback from people, but
Yeah.
if you were working with someone who had poor social skills, maybe didn't come across well to other
Yeah.
people, this maybe wouldn't be the technique to use with them, because they might actually get bad feedback and then be hurt or humiliated, and that's the last thing
Yeah.
you want to do.
Yeah, exactly.
So those are just a brief overview of the truth-based
Yeah.
techniques.
So yeah, what I was, thinking earlier is that the survey technique is actually making an experiment, but it's an experiment where you're actually asking people, what they think.
Yeah.
So it's, it's more like a social experiment as opposed to trying to do something and see what happens.
Yes, and it's especially powerful for social anxiety, and it has to be combined with often with self-disclosure. I myself have had pretty intense social anxiety, and I remember we had to go to this party in Gladwin, Pennsylvania, which we were living in this town, and it's a very fancy, wealthy people, and so we had to go to some holiday party because of the kids, one of our kids in the high school and some friend but it was all these adults, and Melanie and I were thinking, oh gosh, do we have to go to this thing? Because we don't like going to these parties. And
I don't either.
yeah, and so we had to do it. So we got there. So I was talking to this fellow, and I said, well, I might as well, try survey technique and self-disclosure. So I said, I don't know how you feel, but I always feel really uncomfortable at these parties. I think I have a lot of social anxiety because all these people, they seem so high-powered. They're the beautiful people, and they're chattering and drinking cocktails, and I just feel kind of like a fish out of water.
Yeah.
And then he says, I feel exactly the same way.
Yeah.
And then we got involved in a great conversation. Mm-hmm. So again, it was a survey combined with self-disclosure. And it's a very very powerful technique, but it has to be done skillfully, because it can be done in a clumsy way and then get an awkward response.
Yeah, so that's a little bit tricky, and it helps you have somebody who has a keen sense of when to use it and when not to use it.
Yeah, that's why I like to use it a lot on hikes, because I can kind of guide the person that I'm working with, right, and kind of supervise the exposure. And you can also call that a form of interpersonal exposure.
And on a broader topic, I know that sometimes therapists will say, or I will think sometimes, using this technique might backfire. And it's true, some techniques can backfire.
Yeah, all of them can.
All of them can. And so you want to be careful when you propose a technique that you want to stack the deck in your favor.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And then another cool thing you can do, and we've done it before, but I did it down in Pasadena because the therapist was very worried, like they were all in a state of reverse hypnosis down there, thinking, oh, I don't want to use these techniques, they're too far out, too powerful. But one of the therapists said, well, what if you do, this kind of self-disclosure thing and you get a bad result from somebody? And I said, well, let's try feared fantasy.
Yeah.
And so I said, you be the stranger, and I'll be the person doing the self-disclosure, and you can just be as hostile as you want to be.
Yeah.
And so you want to do it? You can be the hostile stranger.
Yeah, I'll be the hostile stranger.
Yeah. Could I speak with you for just a moment?
No.
Oh, okay. Looks like you're tied up. I'll catch you another day.
Yeah. There we go.
We survived.
Yeah.
So you could do things like that too, and rehearse them with your client.
Yeah.
And, would it be the end of the world if you ran into some grumpy or arrogant person?
Yeah, I think it's the magnification we have in our head that really stops us from doing it.
Yeah. And generally you discover the monster has no teeth.
Exactly.
That's the magic of
thing.
exposure.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, I think that's a wrap.
Thanks, Fabrice.
Thanks, David.
This has been another episode of the Feeling Good podcast. For more information, visit Dr. Burns' website at feelinggood.com, where you will find the show notes for this podcast under the blog page, and where you can leave your comments and questions. The website has an abundance of resources for therapists as well as non-therapists, including books, workshops, a list of online training groups around the world, and much more. Theme music is Gypsy Jazz in Paris, 1935, composed and performed by Brett Van Donsel. I am your host, Fabrice Nye, and I invite you to join us next time for another episode of the Feeling Good podcast.